Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. That was the Canadian Grand Prix we all deserved. After Monaco, we desperately needed it, even if it wasn't necessarily the best thing in terms of the World Championship that Max Verstappen took his 6th win in the 9th race of the 2024 season. But this race, what more could a fan's heart desire? Montreal, that was an absolute sensation. A drying track, yet another change to intermediate tyres, then the slicks. Also interesting from a strategic point of view, who changes the tyres and when? Frequent changes of race leaders on the track, this race had it all. And in the end, there was a winner who may not have been in the best car at all, but who did the best job together with the team. 2 other teams could have won this Grand Prix. Which 2 teams and why they didn't make it in the end? We'll explain it now. Obviously, it would have been Lando Norris in the McLaren. In the meantime, I admit it, I often wavered back and forth in this race. At one point I said yes, Norris will win the race, then I once said that Russell would win the race. In the end, however, it was Verstappen who did it. But why did I change my mind so much during the race? Lando Norris got into the race relatively unspectacularly at the start. Russell took the lead from pole position and drove away at the front. Verstappen wasn't necessarily directly in his gearbox, but was able to follow him quite well. Lando Norris, mind you, was 10.2 seconds behind the leader George Russell on lap 10. 10 laps later, Norris then took the lead. He first passed Max Verstappen on lap 19, and then he passed George Russell 1 lap later. How did that happen? You could see that the McLaren's time had come when the intermediate tyres started to degrade on the drying track, especially on the cars of Russell and Verstappen. Norris in particular, but also Piastri, they were both really fast at that moment. Andrea Stella told us later that yes, we saw at the start that we weren't fighting anyone. We can take it easy on the tyres, we can always drive over and cool down. And that paid off then. That's why the tyres were still in such good condition at that point. He says it wasn't anything magical, it was just tactics, and the car and driver factors probably also played a role in this since they protected the tyres quite well. On lap 24, 4 laps after the passing maneuver, Lando Norris already had a margin of 7.7 seconds in the lead, believe it or not. So within 4 laps plus 10 laps, so within 14 laps, he had made up about 18 seconds of time. That was truly a world of its own where he was driving, and Max Verstappen was then in 2nd position. He passed George Russell. We'll take a closer look at that later. Yeah. Then you ask yourself, how could Lando Norris nonetheless lose this race? Yeah, there was a safety car period, and the safety car came at the most inconvenient timing possible. It wasn't as unfavorable as you might have thought at first, because it initially looked as if the safety car had come out when Norris had already passed the pit entrance, as if he no longer had a choice, as if he simply could not turn off to the pits to change tyres. In fact, if you looked at it closely, you saw, okay, he could have come in, he was on the long straight, and then, yeah, he was already relatively near the pit lane entrance. But you could see that the panel at the top showed a safety car he could have driven straight into the pits. McLaren also admitted that. The team from Woking said, yes, it was close, but theoretically, we could have driven straight into the pits. They just simply had to make a quick decision, and they made the wrong decision. On the one hand, they didn't have much time to consider. On the other hand, they were a bit of a victim of their own pace. A victim of their own pace because they were way ahead of the chasing group, just those 7.7 seconds ahead of Max Verstappen. Verstappen and the like then had more time to decide. And on top of that, Norris's tyres were in much better shape than the sets of Russell and Verstappen. Thus, there was a bit more doubt as to whether you had to change from intermediates to intermediates again or continue driving with the first set of the inters. The question now is, who was to blame for making this wrong decision? 1 lap later, Norris came into the pits, but of course he lost time beforehand because he ran up to Bernd Maylander in the safety car and couldn't drive the VSC Delta times, but only the slower pace of the safety car. Blessing in disguise for McLaren, Norris only lost 2 positions, so Russell and Verstappen got past because of this 1 lap which was driven behind the safety car. Who was to blame for the mistake? Was it the team or was it Norris? If you listen to the team radio at that point, Norris asks, box or not? Then his race engineer Jose Manuel Lopez hesitates for a moment and then makes the call stay out. But by then it was already too late anyway. There had already been communication between Norris and the pits in the previous laps whereby one has already carefully sampled what if. Norris, you have to say, He tended to go for slicks when changing tires. Slick tires would definitely have been the wrong decision at that moment, as we will see with Charles Leclerc. But Lando Norris later said, well, the intermediates were already relatively threadbare. Then you knew there was going to be another rain shower. That's why Norris said afterwards that you had to change from intermediates again anyway, most likely to intermediates again. That's why you could have anticipated that, and that's why McLaren reproached themselves afterwards. The team said, well, we could have discussed it beforehand so that we were ready. The safety car phase didn't start completely out of the blue. Williams driver Logan Sargent flew off. When you saw his car, you could already anticipate that there would be a safety car. So you should have thought about it earlier, you should have opened the communication earlier. Therefore, it was McLaren's team mistake. Norris is less to blame. That's why Lando Norris expressed, we should have won, but as a team, we weren't good enough. A clear statement, but team boss Andrea Stella also said something interesting. Mercedes should have finished ahead of us today. And that, of course, brings us to the second team that could have, perhaps even should have, taken the win. Mercedes, first and foremost, of course, with George Russell, who initially led the race. Then we've already said lap 19, 20, 21, that was when things really got dynamic. And Russell kind of lost two positions at once. When Norris passed Russell, he tried to defend himself, tried to save what could no longer be saved, and then went straight out at the chicane. Max Verstappen then also passed him, and that wasn't Russell's only mistake. The Mercedes driver said after the race that he felt like he had let the team down. Toto Wolff said no. The team boss was asked whether Mercedes should have won the race today. He then said, yeah, there were a few minutes of daydreaming, but then reality caught up with us. Toto Wolff doesn't believe that they should have won the race, but I think he knows very well that Mercedes could have won this race, perhaps even had to, but he didn't want to directly blame the drivers. As I said, it wasn't Russell's only mistake. Later, there was another really good chance because when all the drivers switched to the slicks as the track dried up, Russell opted for the hard tires, which is obviously a disadvantage at first because you have to get them up to temperature, but then it turned out to be an advantage in the end because they had very little long-run data and the others might have to struggle with graining. And that's how it turned out, with George Russell passing Lando Norris for second position on lap 49. McLaren also said that the Mercedes had the much better pace in the dry on the slicks. You could see that too. But 2 laps later, after the overtaking maneuver, Russell made the next mistake and lost the position to Norris again. But the final chapter has not yet been written for Mercedes at that moment. There was another safety car period later, and there Mercedes took the opportunity to bring both drivers into the pits. Russell did lose a position to Piastri, but he still had the medium tires in stock for the final sprint because the other drivers who immediately went on medium tires then mostly didn't have a second set of medium tires left, like Lewis Hamilton, who then had to go on hard tires, but he didn't lose a position for it, which is why Mercedes took this gamble. But the pit stops didn't pay off for Mercedes as much as they thought. Russell had major problems with Piastri in the duel, then even lost position to Hamilton and then had to fight his way back. The wheel-to-wheel duel between the Mercedes drivers was also really worth seeing. They both managed to get past Piastri, so it wasn't a catastrophic mistake to make the pit stop, not at all. But on the Mercedes side, they had expected more from it. Lewis Hamilton was also relatively self-critical afterwards. He spoke of a disastrous qualifying as well as of a shocking race. Why it was a shocking race for him? The Mercedes star himself admitted that he had made too many mistakes. If you took a close look at the race from his perspective, you could see that he was the fastest driver at times, especially on the slicks. At times he was even faster than his teammate Russell. But Hamilton was off the track twice. I think it was caught by the TV cameras once and once not. So there would have been a lot more potential on his side. Sure, he messed up qualifying. He was then stuck behind Fernando Alonso for a relatively long time during the race. But you could also see that he was clearly the faster driver and then also had luck with the safety car and so on. Under these circumstances, Lewis Hamilton could have done a lot better. Mercedes could have won this Grand Prix. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this, but I'm also curious to see what questions you have for our Formula One expert. You know that since this season, we've had the AVD Motorsport-Magazin with Christian Danner after every race. And you can ask our expert your questions by posting a comment with the hashtag AskAVD. I can't wait to see what questions you come up with. I'm sure 1 or 2 questions will also be about Ferrari. and what was going on there. On Saturday, it was an absolute disaster, qualifying 11th and 12th position for Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Who would have thought it could get any worse? Double zero score for the Scuderia after Montreal, and that after the promising race in Monaco. That was absolutely nothing. The start for Leclerc was still okay. He overtook Ricciardo and Albon, then he had to let the Haas drivers pass. The two were brave. Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen were the only ones to start on the full wets. That really paid off in the opening laps. But Charles Leclerc had to let the Haas drivers pass not only because of that, but also because he had a problem with his engine from lap 2 onwards. He realized early on that something was wrong. He asked his race engineer, "What's going on?" Then Brian Bosey, Leclerc's race engineer, said that they've got a problem with the engine. It's costing you about half a second. It was half a second at the beginning when the track was still quite wet. Since under these conditions, of course, performance is not quite as important as on a dry track. As the track gradually dried out, the half a second became a whole second. Ferrari still don't know exactly what was going on. Team boss Fred Vasseur told us that 80 HP was missing, but it probably wasn't the combustion engine. It was something to do with the control unit. They had hoped for a red flag. From Ferrari's point of view, unfortunately, there didn't come a red flag in Montreal. Then they could have simply restarted the engine completely and hoped that the whole thing would disappear. During the safety car period, the first one, they conducted. At the end of the safety car period, the stop took 25 seconds. Leclerc fell a long way back and wasn't even able to catch up with the field for the restart. But it wouldn't have mattered anyway, because the Scuderia was really brave and said, okay, now we'll be the first team in this race to use slicks. They sent Charles Leclerc out on the hard tires, and what followed was a slapstick interlude, especially on the radio with his new race engineer, with Brian Bosey. Yes, Leclerc had to take the rap for the risk. It was already foreseeable that it wouldn't go well because the weather forecast was that it would start to rain again. The track was almost ready for slicks, but not quite. Turns 1 and 2 took a little longer to dry out, and then the rain arrived. Charles Leclerc immediately wanted to switch back to intermediates. Brian Bosey then said, well, that's only 1 or 2 laps. Just make sure that you somehow keep the car on the track and then you'll be faster. Charles Leclerc then said, well, I'm already losing 10 seconds on a single lap. He then corrected himself relatively quickly. Damn it, it's already 20 seconds. His race engineer answered, yeah, just stay on the track and then you'll get faster. But no, not a bit of it, that was nothing. 3 laps later, he came in for a stop and then put the intermediates back on. It didn't matter at all. Several laps later, Charles Leclerc was relieved. He was allowed to retire. As hectic as it was on the radio, Charles Leclerc later showed himself to be very understanding and of course took his team under his wings. He said that the decision to go out on slicks was the best thing they could have done at that moment. This statement seems a bit strange, but of course Ferrari had to take full risks. With the problem they had with the engine, they wouldn't have been able to get anywhere anyway. Leclerc said that was the only chance they had of at least getting P9 or P10. It didn't work out. In the end, it resulted in being forced to retire. Carlos Sainz also had to retire as there was relatively little going for him in the race. He had a small contact at the start already, then kept having small contacts, damaged the car and never really got going. Although Leclerc had engine problems, Sainz was even behind him. Then he spun and Alexander Albon crashed into him on that occasion. Albon was not at fault, everything was on Sainz's side, but his car was also damaged in the process. That's why he had to retire. So it was an absolute disaster weekend for Ferrari, though the big question is not what was going on with the engine, even if yeah, the problems are now also becoming more frequent on that side. The question is not what was going on strategically. The question is not why did Sainz run off track, but the big question is why was the performance gone? Ferrari believe it was the tire preparation, meaning they didn't get the tires up to temperature properly. I hope that's the case. Of course, it was a real shame in view of the World Championship when things got a bit more exciting again in the last few races as Ferrari moved closer to Red Bull, and now this 0-point score, anything but ideal. The race was anything but ideal for Sergio Perez as well. He started from 16th position, but then somehow things went even worse. Collided slightly with Pierre Gasly at the start already, damaging his car at this, then changed the front wing, then Perez's race gained a bit of momentum. But then he lost the car and went off track in turn 6. We saw several problems there. Sargent had once been beside the track, Sainz crashed there and then Perez as well. That was the end of the race for him. He somehow managed to tow the Red Bull back to the pits, but of course that made no sense anymore. The damage was too great and couldn't be repaired. There was nothing left for him anyway. But very bitterly, the whole thing had consequences. Sergio Perez had to go to the stewards. They said, the way he returned the Red Bull car to the pits was unsafe. He also scattered carbon parts around the track. So 25,000 euros fine for Red Bull and a grid penalty for Perez. He therefore drops 3 places on the grid in Barcelona. That is really bitter. I think it's a bit pedantic, to be honest. If he had somehow parked the car beside the track, the safety car would have had to come out again. That's exactly what Red Bull wanted to prevent. That's why they said to Perez, you have to drive back. Make sure you get the car back to the pits so that there's no safety car period. It's clear why, because Verstappen was in front. Ironically, the safety car came out a lap later anyway, because Sainz took off and Albon crashed into him. Difficult. Of course, Red Bull tried to gain a sporting advantage by not causing this safety car phase. But actually, it's generally sporting not to cause a safety car phase. Was it really so dangerous that he scattered a few parts around the track? You can argue about that. Later, there were also parts on the track after Yuki Tsunoda went off. Race control didn't do anything about that either. So I don't think you have to be so pedantic at that point. It will certainly lead to discussions. Bitter for Perez, of course. I think his overall weak performance this weekend should be penalized, but not necessarily the fact that he towed the car back to the pits. What's your opinion? Feel free to write it in the comments. Perhaps this is also an interesting question for our expert, Christian Danner. Now we are excited. Firstly, we are looking forward to the video with our expert and what he has to tell us about the Canada Grand Prix. Secondly, we have, of course, lots of exciting things in store for you. We'll also be writing a new print magazine again in the next few days. You can pre-order it already now. And then Barcelona, the European comeback of Formula One, is just around the corner.